Hello and welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Paul Greenhalgh. And today we're going to explore the life and impact of the most famous potter in British history and perhaps one of the most famous in world ceramics. The name Wedgwood is recognised in every British household, and Josiah Wedgwood, the founder of the empire, is one of the giants of 18th century culture. Far more than a potter, he was a leader in the Industrial Revolution. He was an entrepreneur, a scientist, a political thinker, and an anti-slavery abolitionist. But who was he? What was his outlook on life? And how did he create one of the most famous companies in British history? Stephanie's off today, somewhere in the States, but I'm not alone. I'm incredibly lucky to have in the studio the person best able to answer those questions and many more, Sir Tristram Hunt. Sir Tristram is director of the V&A Museum and a leading Wedgwood scholar, amongst other areas of scholarship in British history. His book, The Radical Potter, Josiah Wedgwood and the Transformation of Britain, was published in 2021, and we just happen to have a copy on the table there. Tristram, with the American cover.
The American edition,
yes.
Exactly.
It's a study of the master that in many ways completely changes our view of him. That was my impression of the book, that suddenly Josiah was different. And for that, it's an enormous achievement. Tristram also leads the museum that has no less, and I counted them, 23,718 works and objects associated with Wedgwood, which is truly remarkable. So Tristram, welcome to the podcast.
It's wonderful to be here talking about ceramics and talking about Josiah himself.
So I thought that a good way to start is that you've got a history with Josiah going back, way back. And it's an extraordinary story. And actually, I would say your story intertwined with Josiah is why we have Wedgwood today as we do in public hands. So I think it would be lovely for you to describe that to us to get us going. But also at the same time, you've lived with that man for a long time. And your personal view of him, just at the start, what made him tick and how he saw life, will get us established, I think. Yeah.
Well, Josiah is this remarkable figure in British history and world history, but above all in the history of North Staffordshire, the potteries, Stoke-on-Trent. And whenever you arrive in Stoke-on-Trent, in that wonderful mid-Victorian railway station, which British Rail failed to knock down in the 1960s, you come out and there is the statue of Josiah himself holding an edition of his Portland vase, inspecting it. And you know that this city owes such a huge amount to this one individual. I arrived in Stoke-on-Trent in 2010 to fight the parliamentary seat of Stoke-on-Trent Central, in which Josiah Wedgwood's original factory, Etruria, was based. And you go around Stoke, there's Wedgwood Street, there's Wedgwood Square, there's Etruria, which we'll come on to talk about, which was the name of his factory, is still a council district within the city. So this is a man who permeates the entirety of the city. But when I arrived in Stoke-on-Trent in 2010, and I was fortunate enough to be elected as Member of Parliament, the business itself was in terrible trouble. And in the next few years, it would fall into liquidation. And then we had this terrifying moment that the collection itself would be sold, would be dispersed. Christie's had printed the catalogue, and suddenly the greatest industrial archive of ceramics in the world, one of the greatest collections of ceramics in the world, was at risk of being kind of spent to the winds and lost to posterity.
It's
and
quite extraordinary.
Oh, I mean, it was this terrible quirk in pension law, which meant that the collection was an asset against the value of the company. And so I joined with many others, not least the Art Fund, the National Heritage Fund, many local donors, to save the collection in 2014 and put it into public ownership. And the institution who was placed in charge of the stewardship was the Victoria and Albert Museum. And some years later in the story, I became director of the V&A. So looking after this collection is part of my job now.
So through that time, your view of Josiah?
He's this protean figure. He's this kind of enormous personality, and Carlyle would have him almost as a kind of world historic figure. There's no surprise that William Gladstone was drawn to him. So Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister in the mid-19th century and great historian, was there at all of these dedications to Wedgwood's life in the mid-19th century because he saw him as this figure who combined in one man these incredible forces of industrialization, commercialization, a globalization, transformations in taste, transformations in production. And Wedgwood is, on the one hand, this figure on the pedestal outside Stoke-on-Trent railway station, but he's the most human individual. And the wonderful thing is we have these letters that he sent to his great business partner, Thomas Bentley. So we can chart his life, his adoration of his wife, his love of his children, the way he enjoys to play the game in terms of business opportunities, mistakes he's made, his fury against competitors. So he's a very human person alongside this adamantine figure we know from the history.
Unique in the history of ceramics.
I think unique in the history of ceramics because of the individuality of him. I mean, you have other figures like Josiah Spode II, who's so important in the history of the development of bone china. You've got other great figures at the time, Enoch Wood, Enoch Wedgwood, many other figures in terms of the history of ceramics. But Wedgwood himself punches through that. And partly his brilliance, why we know the name Wedgwood, is he was the great marketeer. He was a great person for brand, for influencing, for identity, all of that, those components of modern marketing we think now. And that's why in the book and more widely, I compare him to obviously Steve Jobs and the founder of Apple, in the sense of mixing that technology, creativity, and brand design together.
I found that comparison, it's quite shocking.
Yes.
And then you take it in and you realise we're dealing with a different creature here.
Yeah.
So I thought for the rest of our first episode, we should look at how he formed his early life, North Staffordshire and so forth. So what kind of family is he born into, and how do we explain this creature? His early life, really.
So Josiah Wedgwood is born in 1730 in Burslem, which is always known as the mother town of the potteries. The potteries of Stoke-on-Trent, 6 towns, which became in 1910, 1911, the Federation of Stoke-on-Trent. But this was a part of the North Midlands of England, between Birmingham and Manchester, which became known for the production of pottery really from the mid to late 1600s onwards. And the reason was you had this incredible combination of the clay and the coal together. So you could dig up the red Staffordshire, the red and yellow Staffordshire clay. You could find coal nearby to provide fuel for the kilns to create the pottery and to have a ceramic industry. And it was a small scale, iterative, industrious business. And the Wedgwood family had been smallholders on the Staffordshire-Cheshire border. They then come into the pottery business. Wedgwood himself is essentially the kind of 3rd or 4th generation within a form of ceramic production, and his uncles are in the pottery business, his brothers will be in the pottery business, and his father, fairly successful, but nowhere near his success. And Wedgwood is born the 12th child, and is at the age, and he's born into both an Anglican and a Unitarian family. So there's a nonconformist, a Protestant dissenting tradition within him, which I think is very important for his approach to innovation, experimentation, science, always looking for new discoveries. And he's apprenticed into the pottery industry quite early on to his elder brother. and he works for his elder brother in the family business, and that will eventually be a source of tension
And we're
between them.
assuming the training there is he would have learned how to throw. He would have learned how to do it.
He would have, but the clincher in the early story of Josiah Wedgwood is the advent of smallpox, and smallpox was racing through the country, and the Wedgwoods lived next to a churchyard where victims of smallpox were being buried. The family suffers from smallpox; they're infected, and the infection really cripples his leg. So his ability to be a thrower, which meant treading the treadle, being able to have the wheel turning with your foot, he's unable really to do that at strength. There's some debate about this because he does throw some pots later, not least when Etruria opens. But really, when he recounts his own tradition of apprenticeship, he's mixing the clay, he's carrying the flint in. He's really at the, an elder brother to a younger brother is not really giving him the opportunities for professional development.
I can imagine he gave him a tough
Yeah,
time.
exactly. William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, always says, well, the fact that he couldn't actually throw, the fact he didn't have the strength to that, meant his mind turned inwards, and what he became was a great designer and a
Yeah.
great innovator
Yeah.
and a great thinker.
Yeah, that's going to be the key to the future, do we think?
That's going to be the key to the future, because he wants to push designs out in different ways
Yeah.
and different formats, different colors, different styles, different materials, and that relentless quest for innovation, experimentation is part of the story of Wedgwood.
Right.
He will know where the market is moving and wants to get there before the public, or at least take the public there.
Yeah. So we're dealing with something which I think it seems to me, going through the centuries, quite common to surround family business, frequently family business, and within the family, quite often specialists who throwers and decorators. And so he's in there. His elder brother takes him in, shows him how to do it, and he's being carried along. And so, in wealth terms, not a rich family, but a family managing well and committed religiously.
Yes, a family managing well, the cousins and uncles sort of doing better than Josiah Wedgwood's immediate family. And the name Wedgwood actually in those days would have referred to some of his cousins who were much more kind of prosperous, also working in Burslem. But he is going to, in a sense, move outside the limitations
Yeah.
of his family. And crucially, definitely, I mean, he loved his brothers and he'd worked with his brothers closely in the decades to come, but move beyond the apprenticeship he was gifted.
I have to say, a lovely quotation which you use, and I found we're both museum people. So, Robert Plott, the first director of the Ashmolean, in 1686, he says, the greatest pottery they have in this country is carried out at Burslem, near Newcastle under Lyme, where for making their several sorts of pots they have so many sorts of clay, which is dug half a mile from the town, and being found near the coal, and are distinguished by their colours. So at the time, it had already become the place, the potteries.
Absolutely. And this is where we get the phrase pothole from, because they were just digging the clay out of the ground. So the roads were all rutted. It was all in a terrible condition. But this was today we would call it a cluster. It was an industrial cluster. And rather like, Detroit is Motor City, Stoke-on-Trent was the potteries and is the potteries.
Yeah. Now, having an older brother myself who spends his life telling me how to live my life, I always get the impression Josiah got a bit sick and fed up of his brother.
Yes.
And he went to apprentice with Thomas Wealden,
Yes.
who was already well established and an interesting man. Do you think that's a key to his growth?
Definitely. The brother, Thomas, had enough of him anyway, because who wants a clever younger brother saying, have you thought about this and have you thought about that? So thank you. The apprenticeship comes to an end. He gets his, service record. And Wealden takes him in Fenton, in Stoke-on-Trent. And Wealden is working with lots of different colours in Rococo styles. So what are they creating? They're creating those incredible teapots, of cauliflowers, of
They're wonderful
pineapples,
things, aren't they?
those yellows, those greens, those browns, and all cutlery services, bowls, plates, all of that material, and Wedgwood learns a huge amount from him, and again that culture of experimentation and innovation.
A big figure in himself, Wealden.
Wealden, a very, very big figure in himself,
Mm.
and a good relationship with Wedgwood, seeing the kind of brilliance of the young man, but also knowing, he was on his way.
Yeah. So this young man, who can't really make the pots himself through illness, 1759, he's back in Burslem and the Ivy House works, so he sets up himself.
Yes.
That's not an easy thing to do, is it?
No, and again, the story of Wedgwood is is as an entrepreneur and a business leader, but the breakthrough for Wedgwood is the production of creamware.
Yeah.
And so moving away from those rich kind of rococo forms and colours to a clean, easily produced, easily manufacturable product, which to his mind is going to rival porcelain. That Wedgwood's breakthrough is to create a ceramic form which allows for transfers, copper printed transfers to be placed on it, so the design and the style of it can move, but also it can be manufactured at lower cost. And what Wedgwood is doing, though, is he's not using the local clay. He's not using the Staffordshire clay. He's bringing in the clay from Cornwall, from Devon, from Dorset. So the white clay, mixing it with the flints, and creating this new clean product, which really is at the beginning of his brilliance.
Yeah. Do we think, it always seems to me that there are grand debates, as we both know, about the Industrial Revolution, including did it ever happen? But assuming it did, very different from the textile industry, what's happening in Stoke. But do we think Josiah's really at the eye of the storm here? I mean, experiment, developing the chemistry, looking at already with Creamware, and this idea of a clean white body, which mimics porcelain, perhaps, is something we can come back to with the Jasper discussion. But he decides he wants a different product from what's going on locally.
He does, and he's seen what's happened to the very brilliant potter, known historically, William Cookworthy, who tried to create porcelain, succeeded in creating porcelain, but absolute bankruptcy. The heat required, the material cost, the inability to produce at scale, and to go back to that Steve Jobs idea, Wedgwood's brilliance is going to be taking style, taking creativity and design, and marrying it with business acumen. And is this the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? I mean, I think the historical debate is, an industrious revolution, partly, that you have and all of those wonderful accounts by the author Daniel Defoe of his journeys through England, this quickening of the economic pace in the mid 1700s, right across the country, and whether that's the Protestant work ethic, whether it's changes through the agricultural revolution, whether it's money coming from the Atlantic economy of sugar and slavery beginning to transform a consumer economy. But then you also have supply side changes in terms of crucially new energy sources, in terms, obviously, all of the coal being utilized, and as we'll come on to see, the canals. So you've got, a quickening commercial world, you've got new sources of energy, you've got new sources of infrastructure, and what you've got in the middle of that is Wedgwood in Burslem, in Stoke-on-Trent, then introducing a new ceramic form into the market, with his marketing behind it, which is really transformative then in terms of ceramic production.
Making use of all those vehicles you described.
Absolutely, and his gift is both in terms of manufacturing. If we think of how he makes his plates, how he makes his ware, rather than having this sort of expensive system of individual specialist productions. What he wants is the division of labor. And this is one of the great kind of challenges of Wedgwood. On the one hand, he's this great individual, he's a great sort of artist, he's a great designer, but Marx and Engels and others would see absolutely the beginning of the separation of labor from capital, the exploitation, systems of the division of labor. And he himself looks to what's happening in Birmingham. He looks to what's happening around to Richard Arkwright, and we mentioned the textile industry, to improve the systems of production whilst celebrating individual artistry. So there are also changes in bookkeeping, quite dry stuff about accountancy, which are also really important to the successful management of his business.
And I guess we're not long into that moment, are we, where people go to work rather than domestic, huge amount of ceramic being made where people actually lived
Absolutely.
in family.
And there are these, it's a very E.P. Thompson landscape of struggle, in a sense, of new systems of kind of work and play, the end of, getting drunk on Monday, St. Monday and all of that kind of stuff. And there are these, he recounts these struggles with the workers who, whether it's over pay or whether it's over time, lockouts, some violence here and there. And again, on a contradiction of Wedgwood, on the one hand, quite a radical figure in terms of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the abolition of the trade in slaves, but also absolutely wanting to get his money's worth from his workers. And, they've got to be in on time. He introduces systems to make sure that there's a kind of oversight of the workers, all of that at the same time as a kind of, more progressive social vision.
So this man from his portrait, who looks like a lovely, gentle, the kind of uncle you would want, who always brings you sweets. But there's another Josiah.
There's a tough Josiah, there's a tough Josiah with his workforce, but also he's absolutely sort of on it in terms of intellectual property rights.
Yeah.
And so again, another of the great innovations of Wedgwood is the back stamp. And that was partly around branding, but it was also around intellectual property, that you knew you were buying a Wedgwood. And we, when I was a member of Parliament with colleagues, we were always battling this issue of cheap imports, falsely backstamped about where they were made. And that conversation goes right back to Wedgwood in the 1760s and 1770s.
So to step back briefly, 1764, he marries his cousin, Sarah, and then they proceed to have 8, is it?
Yes, not all of them make it to adulthood, but and the marriage to Sarah is both a sort of beautiful marriage. He's very uxorious. He adores her, and he sort of pursues her. He marries quite old to the time, so and it takes a while to convince Sarah's father that he should indeed marry her, because Sarah does bring with her a welcome degree of capital. And actually, it's a sort of complicated time for the business in terms of cash flow, in terms of some of the improvements they need to make. And so this influx of capital is really very, very welcome. But he adores her, and they have this lovely family. And his eldest child, Suki Wedgwood, is really the apple of his eye. And there are all these beautiful letters to Suki, and of course, Suki would go on to marry the son of Wedgwood's great friend Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus Darwin's son is Robert Darwin, and Suki and Robert marry, and their son is, of course, Charles Darwin. And so Charles Darwin's grandfather is Josiah Wedgwood on one hand and Erasmus Darwin on the other, and that's a pretty strong intellectual lineage. But there's also this terrible.
It's incredible.
It's incredible. But there's also this terrible story of Charles Darwin really not liking all of the Wedgwood he inherits, and he goes off and sells an edition of one of the vases so he can buy some watercolors.
Survival of the fittest,
Exactly.
I guess. Yes, absolutely, yeah. So to sum up, he's moved beyond the normal family business. He's set up on his own. He's married. He's happy. He's out there. And by the mid-1760s. So Thomas Bentley, perhaps the single most important relationship that Josiah had for his outlook on life. Apparently he met Josiah in 1763 and they formed a close friendship. Who was this character?
So it's an interesting story of him meeting Wedgwood. Remember, that damaged leg, that crippled leg, and he's going on a business trip to Liverpool, where he's exporting material, he's working with
Yep.
Sadler's and Wells, and he damages his leg in the journey, and he has to kind of rest up. And because he has this nonconformist inheritance, this Unitarian inheritance, this dissenting inheritance, he's part of a kind of secret network almost of nonconformists and dissenters. And remember, there was still very strict kind of official discrimination against those who were not Anglicans, those who were nonconformists. And in the northwest, particularly around Warrington and parts of Liverpool, you also had a really strong dissenting tradition. So he's in Liverpool, he's laid up, and essentially through the dissenting networks, he meets, scientists, writers, but also crucially this man called Thomas Bentley, who is a merchant. But he's a merchant with a much more metropolitan, cosmopolitan sensibility than Wedgwood. And Wedgwood, the sort of provincial boy from Stoke-on-Trent, slightly falls for Bentley, this more worldly figure who'd been travelling and all the rest of it. And they form this very effective business partnership. And Bentley is very, very good at understanding the changing nature of the consumer market and understanding what people think they will want. And he's particularly good at the female market and understanding, what female consumers might want from ceramics. And so when we look at Wedgwood and Bentley as a business, Josiah's brilliance in terms of material development, production, systems management, and Bentley very good at retail marketing, ensuring that they kind of do the needful, as he used to say, with the expanding markets.
And I think it would be very interesting to talk about Creamware, perhaps his single greatest. Is that his greatest invention? One of his greatest.
I think creamware and jasperware are the great inventions
Yeah.
but creamware does really build on a series of experiments by other potters, Enoch Wood, Enoch Wedgwood, Booth, within the potteries. Wedgwood kind of codifies that production more effectively. Is very smart about using transfers on it. So new designs, particularly, from the copper printed transfers coming out of Liverpool, new designs for specific markets, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And then crucially, branding, because Wedgwood's isn't creamware, it's queensware. Because Josiah Wedgwood's brilliance is to send his brother to court to ensure that Queen Charlotte sees the quality of their ware. They send them, sends her a great case of creamware. They start to use it, and then Wedgwood rebrands it Queensware and styles himself Potter to Her Majesty. So suddenly, this is the most fashionable ceramics you can get. And the story of Wedgwood is, yes, the story of production in North Staffordshire, Stoke-on-Trent, but it's also the story of incredible retail brilliance in London. And central to that is Josiah Wedgwood's business partner, Thomas Bentley.
But there's so much in European ceramics through these centuries, which was about the pursuit of white and hugely important. And Josiah, it seems to me, creamware was about that. But he says this, again, quoting, he says this in 1767, quoted from your book. I'm going on with my experiments upon various earths, clays, etc., for different bodies, and shall next go upon glazes. Many of the experiments turn out to my wishes and convince me more and more of the extensive capability of our manufacture for further improvements. is at present comparatively in a rude, uncultivated state, and may easily be polished and brought to much greater perfection. So he's aware of what's going on around him, but he's looking elsewhere. The
Absolutely.
competition's
Oh
elsewhere.
yeah, no.
Yeah.
And what I love about all those is Wedgwood sees himself in time. He does see himself as this kind of, world historical figure, and likes to analyze himself almost as the sort of third person in this moment of criticality. Yeah, I mean, porcelain was the most sophisticated, the most beautiful, the most admired ceramic body. We know that Henry VIII probably had porcelain in his court. We know Francis I in France, Catherine de Medici. Porcelain was coming into the market just at very elite royal levels from the early 1500s, and then of course through the East India companies, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the British. It's being imported in, and as it were, it is made for export in China. And then, in Holland, Delftware is obviously impersonating it. In Britain, those who seek to, and Edmund de Val's wonderful book, exploring the White Road, exploring the kind of search for the pure white, people go mad. We know Augustus the Strong. We know the story of sort of alchemy trying to create the secret of porcelain. And in Britain, the Puritan potter William Cookworthy is the man who breaks the code of the Caerlyn code for the production of porcelain, but it's ruinously expensive. So great, you can create your beautiful tiny, paper thin white porcelain jug, but in doing so, you're ruined. And Wedgwood says, okay, well look, there's this huge market for whiteware, for clean dining services and ceramic form. But I don't want to go bankrupt making it. So what I'm going to do is create a ceramic body, Creamware, which looks kind of like porcelain, but I can produce, at a good cost for this emergent middle class. And if they want, pictures of pheasants on it, or if they want armorial crests, or if they want pictures of stately homes on it, well, I can put the transfers on that for whichever relevant market demands it.
We should let Sadler and Green was the company, wasn't it, in Liverpool,
Yes,
who developed printing
yes.
onto ceramic, and Wedgwood picks up on that.
And that again points to this, wonderful global connections. There he is in the narrow vale of North Staffordshire, but actually he's thinking about markets in the West Indies. He's thinking about markets in Turkey. He's thinking about the European continent, because he's sending his ware up to Liverpool. They're having the transfers applied, and then he's exporting it around the world.
Yeah.
And the canals, obviously, are such an important part of that.
The empire, you've written very widely on empire and its impact upon Britain. Josiah picked up on that pretty early on. Surely he was sending his work abroad.
He was, and what's there are many interesting components to it, but originally, his big market is the east coast of America. It's the American seaboard. It's Philadelphia. It's Boston. It's New York, who are all looking at British fashion. They're all reading The Spectator. They're all taking the right clothes from London, and so Wedgwood is fashionable, and so it's a big export market there. But also, you can see when you go around the old plantation houses in the Caribbean, he's exporting to the West Indies, he's exporting to those slave economies, but not least because that Atlantic model of sugar and slavery is very important for the consumer economy in the UK, because whether it's hot chocolate, whether it's tea, whether it's jam, whether all these components of the new rituals of sociability, Wedgwood is going to provide the ceramics for them to have those new tastes and new forms and tea parties.
So actually what we're saying is it would appear to be the 1760s. I think there's debate about when pure creamware comes, but 1762, so it's there. 1769, the Etruria factory opens. And so through the 60s, he develops this body, he starts looking to selling internationally, and he builds a new factory.
So he,
Tell us something about
yeah.
Etruria.
So
Yeah.
he moves from Ivy House Works and the kind of pot bank, as we call them,
Mm.
in Burslem to a new facility. He buys this estate and builds both a factory and his own house,
Mm.
and his house overlooks the factory. Crucially, he also ensures that the new Trent and Mersey Canal, for which he is the treasurer, goes right past the factory. So it means the economics of this is absolutely fundamental. It means the cost of transporting the clay up from Devon and Dorset falls markedly, and then the cost of transporting his wares safely up to Liverpool or over to the east towards Hull falls as well. So there's a huge increase in profit in that period. And Etruria, which he used to spell with an H, Etruria, because he had no idea what this thing was. Obviously based upon
That is so
Etruscan,
funny.
I know,
Yes.
Etruscan civilization, which he kind of liked the sound of because of all of the new archaeological discoveries in Pompeii and Herculaneum and the Grand Tour. Brings together all the different components of making pots, and he does it on one side. And the model here is the great factory Soho House and Soho by his friend Matthew Bolton in Birmingham. And Bolton there made toys. He made metalware in a very kind of Birmingham way. But it was an enormous factory. And Wedgwood sees the cost efficiency embedded there. So when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we do think of Bolton's factories. We think of Richard Arkwright and Cromford, but we should also think of Wedgwood and Etruria.
I mean, is it too crude to say assembly line?
Not too crude at all, very much an assembly line. And there's this sort of terrifying quote that Wedgwood says that he wants to make machines of the men such as cannot err, so that he doesn't want any imprecision. And he falls out with some of his workers here because they had a certain flair, they were certain potters, their style would be in the pot. And Wedgwood wants to strip out all of that individuality. He wants to strip out, in a sense, that humanity in each of the pots and just wants a really uniform quality product coming out the other side.
Which is an extraordinary piecing together the ethics of it, because in many ways we see Wedgwood as, we don't really have left or right yet, but if we did, in many ways on the liberal left, outlooking, but actually also the assembly line is seen by many in the coming decades and centuries as being this nightmare of destruction of humanity. But he brings the two together.
It brings you, and the Bloomsbury Group were always very sniffy about Wedgwood, partly because they saw him as kind of destroying the individual, the capacity of the individual worker. I mean, he's completely sort of un-Ruskinian. But this again is the interesting contradiction to go to where we started recently. He's a man of the Enlightenment. He is a man of growth and individuality and experimentation and fulfillment at the same time as sort of crushing the workers to ensure an absolutely precise piece of, creamware or jasperware or basalt or caneware or, whatever they're producing.
Production systems driven by science, and
Yes.
he invents the chronometer.
Yes. So the great, problem of ceramics is, what is the heat in the kiln? And because you can lose so much wear, an entire kind of, shelf can crack due to getting the heat wrong. And so you had these very, very, sort of wise workers the kiln men who were kind of knew about different heat levels and could judge it and all the rest of it, but it was still very imprecise. And what Wedgwood seeks to create is this new thermometer, this new system of accounting for heat. I mean, it's, as it were, modern scientific sort of critique suggests it didn't really work, and it was fairly flawed. But again, it points to Wedgwood's belief in
Probably better than what
experimentation
was around.
better than what was around, and it makes him a fellow of the Royal Society. So,
So I'm sure he
at the
wasn't
time,
complaining
yeah,
about
I
it.
know it was peer reviewed effectively at the
Just below
time.
the history of ceramics, outside most of the major centres, there were large artificial hills full of wasters
Yes, exactly.
because of kiln failure.
Yep, yeah,
So he reduces that.
yeah, yeah.
You refer to Josiah as an Enlightenment figure. The Enlightenment, which we should say, it's later 17th, 18th century, a different vision of humanity, a different vision of life, which clearly Josiah picks up on.
Absolutely, but also for Wedgwood, in terms of the Enlightenment, it's also the English Enlightenment, because he sits within a community of radicals, thinkers, innovators, based in in Stoke and Leicester and Derby and Nottingham and Birmingham, who are also thinking about natural philosophy, scientific experimentation. There's this amazing club called the Lunar Society where they all meet and discuss these ideas. And it's an idea of enlightenment. It's an idea of the capacity for human fulfillment vis-a-vis kind of the natural world. So you've got the European Enlightenment, partly based around ideas of modernity, and then you also have this English Enlightenment, much more focused on natural philosophy and histories of radical dissent as well.
The religious dimension to this, I mean, presumably the Lunar Society and the people who adhere to it are pushing back, as it were, the mythology of religion in favour of science, or is that too crude a thing to say?
It's a different idea of religion. It's an understanding of the revelation of God's grace through the workings of the natural world. And in
Yeah.
a sense, the more you understand through experimentation and discovery and innovation, the natural world, then in a sense, the closer you are to the Godhead. And the great figure of this is obviously Joseph Priestley, the chemist who discovers, as it were, oxygen, even though it was there before he discovered it, who combined, a tradition of Protestant dissent with experimentation. What that did lead to was a kind of radical politics, which was hostile to the state and to church and to king and those other components. But it's a line of radical Protestantism which connects to scientific inquiry.
Yeah. So it seems to me that a vase that pulls a lot of this together, the first day vase, where we're told, and whether it's true or not, you may know whether you think it's true or not, where Wedgwood and Bentley make the pot themselves. And apparently Bentley was kicking the wheel because Josiah couldn't. And they threw a pot and then had it decorated. And the first day vase was to celebrate the opening of Etruria, the factory. So it all comes together.
Yeah, and I think there are 4 birthday vases left, and there's one in the Wedgwood Museum. There's one in the Potteries Museum in Hanley in Stoke. There's one I think there are a couple in private collections, and we love these because we know the provenance of them. He's written on them saying this is to celebrate the opening of the factory. They have a huge kind of hog roast and a big party, and it's this lovely moment. And he creates this almost this sort of Greek vase, this Etruscan vase to celebrate the opening of Etruria, and it's this celebration of his loving friendship with Bentley. He's always trying to convince Bentley to move to Stoke, and Bentley says, "No, I'm going to live in London or Liverpool or elsewhere." And then this new world they're forging, at which Etruria, the factory, is at the heart of it.
Classical style, the Etruria factory, and a very clever man at marketing, Bentley. So we're all set.
Yep.
For the empire to hugely grow. And then moving, and I find it, the description in your book, it's so harrowing that in 1768, Josiah loses his right leg. And what I find staggering, looking at the letters and so forth at the time, is how it's done. We're in an age before anaesthetic of any significance. He says this not long, just immediately before: "I shall not go to London so soon as I expected. It's a very disagreeable business which keeps me so long at home." So that's it.
I mean, the leg is removed from below the knee without anaesthetic on the 31st of May. And he always writes in his diary for the 31st of May, St. Amputation Day. And he recovers extraordinarily well. And he then sort of works on the prosthesis and how he's going to have his kind of wooden leg and, how it's going to work. And, and he never complains. He never moans about it. He's almost drawn to the hideous experimentation of it in a way, and wants to recount how well it's doing, and what he's learned from it.
It's really quite staggering. There's a letter, and I think it can only be 8 or 9 days after the operation. He says, "Had 2 airings in a chaise. Have left off my laudanum and do much better without it. The skin on the upper part of the wound is healed and got down to the bone, which I tell you to confute all those who deny the present age to be an age of miracles." So, he's only 8 or 9 days, having gone through this without anaesthetic, laudanum to keep him, but he doesn't like it because it makes him feel woozy.
Yeah.
And we're talking about an extraordinarily tough man.
Extraordinarily tough. And then he'll also sort of talk about it with Erasmus Darwin from a scientific perspective, because Erasmus Darwin was a great, medical figure and doctor. So, and then this becomes, Josiah is then known as Old Wooden Leg in the pots, because he stomps around with his wooden leg, and before they knocked it down, before they knocked Etruria down, it was always said that in the wooden stairs going up to his office, you could see the indentation of his kind of wooden peg leg into the wood itself.
No self-pity.
No, absolutely none.
Yeah. And we're coming. I thought a nice way to finish our first episode. Is it the single greatest commission of any British ceramic company so far? The Frog Service. And 1773, Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, commissions from Wedgwood, when she has the whole of Europe to look at the Frog Service, which is a 50-person service. 1,222 scenes of the British landscape are going to Russia, which I'm sure has its own political dimension to it. And I'm not sure what it meant at the time, but we have a number, £2,290, which I think would have been a fortune at the time. I mean, do we see this as one of the great things?
Oh, totally. And it speaks to so much about Wedgwood, because part of the reason Catherine the Great is going to commission the service is because of all Wedgwood's brilliant marketing with the the British diplomatic community in St. Petersburg, using merchant routes. Remember, there was a huge, commerce between London and St. Petersburg at that time. Russia was a really important market for England, and Wedgwood is always sending out kind of lost leaders, and the wives of diplomats, the wives of ambassadors, he particularly focuses on. So he's kind of pushing his wares there, but part of the reason is, as you say, political. That what Catherine the Great wanted, and she is this Enlightenment figure, as she tries to kind of move Russia towards a more kind of European sensibility. She wants her court to see what an enlightened nation with, trading systems, civil society, the rule of law, commerce looks like. And so she wants an idea of Britain. She wants an idea of the UK on this dinner service for her. So it's an ideological account of the meaning of Britain to be sent to Russia. And at the heart of it are all these incredible depictions of landscapes, of stately homes, of cityscapes, even industrialization. They have Coalbrookdale. So they depict the Industrial Revolution happening on a dinner service alongside this amazing depiction of the Thames with all of the boats and wealth and all the rest of it. So there's none of the sort of poverty. There's none of that E.P. Thompson world of Whigs and Hunters. There's none of the immiseration. There's none of the Black Axe. There's none of the, it's a sort of wondrous idea of England presented to the court of Catherine the Great.
And important to remind ourselves, we're the most powerful nation on earth at that stage. I don't think there would be huge. Well, the French perhaps would dispute, but nevertheless, Britain and industrialization, modernization, Enlightenment, which Catherine recognized, because I was always puzzled why she was happy with all those scenes of Britain on a service that was going to be in St. Petersburg.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it was. I think it was to direct her court to think this was the pathway we wanted to go to in the future. Enough of the kind of autarky, enough of the sort of, feudalism. This was the kind of prosperous commercial civil world that Russia should head towards.
Yeah. So I think that's a nice point to pull the first episode to a close. Josiah has gone through a tremendous personal life, which has seen him survive health-wise, be married, have 8 children, and to create his factory, which is beginning to dominate European ceramics at that stage, would we say? Probably
Yes, and
dominating.
he's exporting into France, he's exporting into the German states, he's
Yeah.
exporting right across the world.
So the British royal family are buying it, but actually the Russian empress is buying it. So a nice point, I think, because in many respects, the way we think of Wedgwood and the way the general public think of Wedgwood still hasn't actually taken shape. So in the next episode, we'll look at the wares that really the world knows him for and what still make Wedgwood the brand that we can all recognise, but also Josiah's political and social outlook, which is really quite spectacular and bears examination, I think, as this Enlightenment figure. So, his greatest wares and his political outlook. Next time. To find out more and to see all of the works we've been talking about in this episode and all our episodes, go to heni.com/the history of ceramics, or go to the HENI Talks YouTube channel.